Welcome to the 700 Club. A blistering report has been released on the police response to the brutal attack inside Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. Surveillance footage reveals that the shooter fired most of the 142 rounds before any law enforcement officer took action.
Altogether, 376 officers responded to the 77-minute attack that killed 21 people, mostly children. Texas lawmakers blame systemic failure on all levels, citing confusion about who is in charge and a breakdown in communication. Dale Hurd has the tragic details.
Newly released surveillance footage shows the scene inside Robb Elementary during the attack. The shooter, who reportedly had never fired a weapon before that day, walked into room 111 through a door with a lock that had been broken for months. Most of the 142 rounds fired inside the building occurred before any first responders ever set foot inside. The scathing 77-page preliminary report from the Texas House found that while there was a small army of law enforcement responders at the school that day, there were failures on every level.
If there's only one thing that I can tell you is there were multiple systemic failures.
376 officers responded to the shooting, the majority of them from federal and state agencies. But no one established a command post, leading to confusion, miscommunication, and delay.
If you know there's active shooting, active killing going on, or somebody is dying, the standard is you have to continue to do something to stop that killing or stop that dying.
The report blamed egregiously poor decision-making for police inaction and noted that those officers who wanted to enter the building
were either denied access to the building, were told misinformation, some were even told false information.
City officials released police body cam footage in an effort to provide what they called further and necessary context. Uvalde police officer Eduardo Canales, injured by gunfire, urges others to go in.
We gotta get in there, he just keeps shooting.
But the report concluded law enforcement responders failed to adhere to their active shooter training, and they failed to prioritize saving innocent lives over their own safety. Some families of victims were there to receive the report, including Uzziah Garcia's father.
Whatever I see in this report's not gonna bring my son back, but we need to prevent it so somebody else won't lose their son, or their daughter, their kids.
There is also more information on the attacker, who had developed a fascination with school shootings and made threats of violence on social media platforms. Some even gave him the nickname School Shooter, but apparently never reported his behavior. The report also found that Robb Elementary was not adequately prepared for an armed intruder, and it's possible that some of the 19 children and 2 teachers killed might be alive today if they had not had to wait 73 minutes to be rescued. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Well, the 376 officers who responded are going to have to live with the results that they didn't obey the training on active shooters. For whatever reason, they thought it was some kind of hostage situation and therefore were waiting for further instructions before proceeding inside. You know, there's a lot to learn from the U.S. military, particularly the U.S. Army, and how do you have decision-making right there on the ground as opposed to trying to go back to a command center. But the systemic failures, they didn't even establish a command center. They didn't establish proper chain of command and proper information going to the officers inside the school. This is something that we're all going to shake our heads over for a very long time. But how do we stop it? How do we stop this kind of attack? And, you know, that we look at how did he get not just 1, but 2 assault rifles? Apparently never shot a gun before in his life, but here he is able to get 2 of them. The magazines on those allowing that kind of violence, 142 shots. You just go, well, can we at least restrict that and restrict access? Should there be some kind of early warning system that if you think someone could be a school shooter, that you have a procedure where you can notify authorities and shut down access to assault weapons? These are all things we're going to be debating and going to be debating for a very long time. But my heart goes out to the officers who didn't respond, because they're going to have to live with it, and they're going to have to live with it the rest of their lives. In other news, President Biden is back in Washington after a 5-day Mideast trip to Israel and Saudi Arabia. He leaves behind a region at a dangerous geopolitical crossroads. Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem.
During the Saudi Arabian leg, President Biden emphasized the U.S. commitment to the region. He talked of wanting to prevent Russia and China from filling a Mideast vacuum he admits the U.S. created.
But let me conclude by summing all this up in one sentence. The United States is invested in building a positive future in the region in partnership with all of you, and the United States is not going anywhere.
A question from the beginning was, how would the president deal with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who he believes murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi? The answer came in a fist bump, a picture seen around the world.
Do you regret the fist bump, Mr. President? You guys talk about something that matters. I can ask what questions matter.
Despite this awkward relationship, part of Biden's wish list included asking the oil giant to produce more, hoping it would lower the price of gas in the U.S.
The kingdom had announced it increased its maximum production capacity to 13 million barrels a day. The kingdom has no spare capacity to increase production beyond that.
The greater issue for the region, however, is Iran's growing nuclear program and uranium enrichment.
We call on them to comply with international law, to not interfere with the international affairs of other nations, to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and to fulfill its obligations in this regard.
Biden sees diplomacy as the best solution to stop Iran's nuclear program, although for some in Israel, that's not good enough.
Certain key people in the IDF were really, as they say, freaked out by Biden's unwillingness to do anything at all to prevent Iran from putting nuclear weapons together and deploying them against Israel.
Foreign policy analyst Carolyn Glick calls the Biden administration backward as it confuses friend and foe.
Iran is an enemy of the United States that seeks its annihilation. And on the other hand, Saudi Arabia has been an American ally for 80 years. So it doesn't make sense why the Biden administration would want to give some sort of, celebrity discount to Iran and treat Saudi Arabia so harshly when the former is America's enemy and the latter is America's ally.
As for Israel, with a caretaker government and upcoming elections, Glick says this is a dangerous season.
We're in a very difficult and trying time right now, and we just have to hope for the best and hope for the best in terms of the elections so that we'll get, hopefully, again, more competent leadership elected and into office in 4 months. And we have to hope that we'll be able to weather this very dangerous storm.
Well, Chris Mitchell joins us now live from Jerusalem. So speaking in East Jerusalem, President Biden once again brought out that two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. Do the Israelis consider that realistic? And frankly, does anybody view that as realistic?
Well, I don't know about that, Gordon, but most Israelis do not believe in the two-state solution. There was a poll last year, about 40% support it. Although current acting Prime Minister Yair Lapid, he actually said it publicly that he did support it. I think most Israelis, Gordon, moved on. They're feeling that there's really not a reliable partner with the Palestinian Authority. And then on the other hand, Gordon, recent polls have shown that Palestinians support Hamas more than the PA. So any two-state solution would mean a terror group would be in charge of a future Palestinian state. In addition to what he said about the 1967 borders, Gordon, when he met with President Abbas, he pledged hundreds of millions of dollars to UNRWA. That's just a group indoctrinating, another generation of Palestinians. And they also sent a strong signal of a divided Jerusalem. And here's why. He traveled to eastern Jerusalem at that hospital. The entourage actually removed the Israeli flags off the presidential limousine, and then they stated they want to establish a separate consulate in Jerusalem here for the Palestinians. So the Biden administration is fully on board with a two-state solution, even if most Israelis are not.
Well, I've got to ask a follow-up. Do the Palestinians want a two-state solution? You just said that Hamas is likely to win any election. They're quite adamant no on a two-state solution. So Why are we continuing to pursue this myth?
It's a great question, Gordon. You know, in that poll as well, they said most people support Hamas as opposed to the Palestinian Authority. And actually, most Palestinians really don't want a two-state solution. So why would the Biden administration? I'll quote former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. And he said it in his book, Sledgehammer. You interviewed him a few months ago. And he said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. He said in the State Department, it's called diplomacy.
All right, well, let's move on to the other big threat in the region, and that's the Iranians. They now claim that they're technically capable of building a nuclear bomb. So how is Israel responding to the news?
Well, just last night, Gordon, the IDF chief of staff, his name is Kohavi, he said that the IDF is preparing a military option against Iran's nuclear program. He says it's a moral obligation, a national security commandment. And he said the IDF will continue to prepare what he said energetically to attack Iran. He said it's the center of their preparations. And he also said that the nuclear deal being negotiated right now is dangerous. And so he thinks it's a bad thing, but he's trying to do what they can to stop Iran's nuclear program.
Well, it's not just the U.S. having meetings in the region. Vladimir Putin, Turkey's President Erdogan are now meeting with Iran's president, and that's going to happen tomorrow. What are the implications of this meeting? What's the purpose of the meeting?
Well, part of the purpose is coordinating policy on Syria. They're all involved in Syria in one way or another. They're not all friends, but they are all sort of anti-American. They'll be applauding the weakness in the U.S. right now, and they're ready to fill any vacuum. And I would say, Gordon, they represent a dangerous alternative to the Abraham Accords, sort of like a counterweight in the region. I talked earlier today to an Israeli analyst, and he said he's lamenting what's going on with the U.S. right now. The Biden administration right now in the region is considered very weak. Another sign of what's going on in the region is some of these Gulf countries that really were signatories of the Abraham Accords, what they're saying now. The UAE says it wants to build bridges with Iran. Egypt saying they don't want a regional alliance against Iran. So that's why Carolyn Glick in our story said we're entering into a dangerous time. You got a weak USA, a transitional government here in Israel, and Iran now a threshold nuclear power, which is why it's so important to be praying right now for Israel and for the entire region.
Well, Chris, thanks for the insight. We'll certainly be praying for Israel, praying for the peace of Jerusalem, and please be in prayer. The weakness that we're expressing on the international stage is truly astounding. But there's also weakness in the government in Israel, and they're going to have to wait for new elections. So this is a dangerous time, very dangerous time for Israel.